I guess we'll get started. It's 7:35, so I'm gonna hit the mute for now. Um, Before we get started, though, I want to just let's see. Thought I'd share this with folks. I just got this today. Let me get into share screen. Oh, righty. With your indulgence, Bruce Jurgen. A reminder that when we talk about Southern Jews and civil rights in the Black community, I mean, I don't have to tell you that it was living history for folks who were alive and growing up at the time. But this is from the USY International Convention, when the regional president at the time, a fellow named Bruce Jurgen, introduced a resolution condemning segregation. And you can see Bruce was kind enough to, this is February 64. So this is in the months leading up to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was at the end of the summer, and that was the federal law that made segregation and separate but equal illegal in public accommodations. And we'll see the resolution says the Negro Campaign for Equal Opportunity and Civil Rights demands the cooperation and support of every Jew. The Torah teaches the equality of man and requires fair and equal treatment for all. And then if you go down a little bit, towards this end, we resolve to refrain from frequenting segregated establishments and to indicate to such places our vehement disapproval of their discriminatory policy. We furthermore urge the adults of our congregation to work with us and other organizations with the same purpose in this matter. We must support, I'm going down a little bit more, the efforts of Negroes to end discrimination, not only in a legal sense, but also in an economic one. It is fundamental to the success of the revolution. It is equality of job opportunity and freedom from commercial exploitation. All right, so I commend Bruce. I didn't know this, but I didn't know that Bruce was the regional president at the time that he had authored this. I'm so glad he shared it with me. It's nice to see that USY, made a strong and unequivocal statement. The president of USY at the time, I understand, was Danny Siegel. So just a little bit of both center history, Jurgen personal history, and very germane to everything we talked about last week. So I want to thank you, Bruce, for sharing that with me, and it makes me very proud that that I get to be your rabbi.
Rabbi, this is Judy. There's something
Judy.
else you should know that USY did. Is there was I guess it was Jacksonville's version of VISTA, Greater GJEO, Greater Jacksonville Economic Opportunity. I don't know, I can't remember exactly what it was. And USYers got together every Sunday and went to downtown Jacksonville, and we met at a Black church. And I would say we might have had 50 kids, all ages. And we would take them on field trips throughout the area so they could see a broader world. The beach, St. Augustine, various sites in Jacksonville. So USY was very involved. This would be in the this would be around 1965, 66 through 68.
Wow.
So that's another way that Jacksonville U.S. Wires were involved.
Great. And, you know, we've had our own tradition of activist U.S. Wires. We had, you know, a number who, when it came to paying living wages to migrant workers and gun control, we had a number of U.S. Wires that went to Washington to demonstrate after Parkland. So I'm, you know, that's still something that that we do, and something important. So, you know, thank you, Judy, and thank you, Bruce, for sharing that. I wanted to get started. I'm going to share something else here. Let's see. You know, we live in a time of such hyper partisanship and so much angry rhetoric and so much intolerance that I wanted to frame. Here we go. Everybody see this? Which is hopefully obstacles to civil. I'm going to make it bigger because I think there we go. And I'm going to just there. Hopefully that'll be big enough. I want to frame some of this so that I'm very clear as we talk. We'll touch on tonight about things like Black Lives Matter and Jewish relationships at a communal level with Black Americans, etc. So I feel like it's important to put this out there. And I hope that whatever conversation ensues, that, you know, these kinds of parameters are observed, because we are all entitled to different opinions. And it doesn't matter to me if you're on the left or the right, whether you think Donald Trump is the next best thing to sliced bread or better, whether you think Joe Biden is the answer to our country's needs. I'm not venturing into political territory in endorsing candidates, but I do want to make it very clear that when I talk about the issues of Black and Jewish relations, that this is what underlies both my perspective, but also what constitutes the bare bones for civil discourse. So, number one, statements about entire groups of people, whether based on race, religion, ethnicity, sexual orientation, or political affiliation, that paint all members of the group with the same broad brush, indicating they're all in lockstep and are subject to the same nefarious groupthink directive from above. In other words, that's espastnischt. It doesn't go. The Democrats here, these are the examples. They always, believe me, I know some of them, and they never, or the, insert the group name here. You can put in Jews, Democrats, Republicans, whatever it is, Blacks. These are broad brush statements, and they're not part of civil discourse because they make assumptions that if you belong to a group, you're all in lockstep together, that you get your directives from, you know, someplace, and it gets beamed into your brain, and you no longer have your own opinion. There's no nuance, right? So words like always, never, and they, referring to anyone as you know, all members of each and every group must think a certain way exactly, is not helpful. It's also not true. Then there's bias as double standard. By the way, a lot of this I've based on Natan Sharansky. Sharansky has his own criterion of what constitutes legitimate criticism of Israel versus that which is illegitimate. And he has 3 Ds. His 3 Ds are demonization, double standard, and delegitimation. So I take my cue from Natan Sharansky, whom knows a lot more about all of these things from his own personal experience. So bias is double standard, leveling criticism against one group consistently while giving others guilty of similar behavior or worse a pass. Double standards also find expression in the unwillingness to recognize that the very thing one accuses an opponent of may characterize one's own behavioral patterns or those of one's allies. An unwillingness to recognize that some of the things one accuses an opponent of may also, in fact, characterize some of the behavioral patterns in one's own group. Here are some examples. I hate cancel culture. The minute you say anything critical about the current policies of the Israeli government or express concern about Palestinian rights, Jews shut you down with the charge of anti-Semitism. Now compare this. I hate cancel culture. The minute you express any criticism of some of the extremist rhetoric uttered by those who claim to speak for Black Lives Matter, liberals shut you down with the charge of being racist. Right? How, this is, right, kind of a mirror image. Here's another example. David Duke, neo-Nazis, and various white supremacist groups openly support Donald Trump. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who votes for Donald Trump must be a white supremacist and a racist. Versus left-wing extremists and so-called democratic socialists like AOC and the members of the squad who want to undermine Israel support Joe Biden. As far as I'm concerned, anyone who supports Joe Biden must be an enemy of Israel and the Jewish people. One statement comes out of the left, one statement comes out of the right. Both of them are examples of a kind of double standard where if it's your friends who say it, it's okay. If it's the other side who says it, not okay. Sometimes the double standard is also a kind of demonization and a delegitimation. Eleanor Roosevelt once said, and I have this plaque actually in my office, I love it very much. Great minds discuss ideas. Average minds discuss events. Small minds discuss people. Something similar happens with insulting speech and uncivil discourse. All right, at its best, at its highest, civil discourse is framed by the exchange of views and ideas. When I tell you what I think, you tell me what you think. If you disagree with what I think, you explain to me why you think it's not logical. You point out instances. You counter my ideas with other ideas. It's also fair game to point out specific actions and events where one's opponent behaved in a certain way contrary to his stated beliefs, right? If I've said I believe in this, but I may have at another time said something different or did something that runs contrary to that, that's fair game. But at its lowest and most degraded, disagreement is diminished to name-calling, invective, and personal insult. Idiot, enemy, fool, stupid, ugly, demented, hater, racist, bigot, or anti-Semite. There are true bigots and there are true anti-Semites in the world. Lamentably, way too many. The fact that someone may have a different viewpoint doesn't make him a hater, doesn't make him an anti-Semite, doesn't make him a racist. doesn't make him a white supremacist. Right? And demonization can also take the form of comparing individuals or groups to extremist or terrorist organizations, right? Comparing someone to Nazis, Klansmen, Hamas, fascists, communists. They are potent ways to demonize those with different ideas by associating them with those who bomb and maim and who actively support and practice terrorism. The only ones in this world who should be called Nazis are Nazis. Only members of Hamas should be called members of Hamas. They belong to a different terrorist group. If they belong to Hezbollah, then let them be called Hezbollah. But this kind of excessive rhetoric, when somebody might have a different view, right, but isn't engaged in acts of terrorism, doesn't support acts of terrorism, that kind of rhetoric is just not helpful. It adds temperature and does nothing to further discourse. All it does is to demonize. Then it's no longer about, trying to get your point across. It's about simply stoking a fire and creating hate and unfortunate bad feelings where none should exist. We can all have disagreements. So I just put that out there because unfortunately I get email from all kinds of people in our community. I don't respond to them because when it comes to political personalities and which politicians should be kosher and which not, I just don't respond. That's not, I don't work for any political campaign. I have my own ideas, but I see a lot of that. And since some of the things that we'll talk about tonight may touch tangentially upon things like Black Lives Matter, I just want to make that really clear. So people can disagree. Whatever you think, wonderful, but there's a way to do it. Okay, with that, let me stop the share. So, let me talk a little bit about first of all, Jews of color. We sometimes talk about blacks and Jews as if you have blacks and Jews. The fact is there are Jews of color. There are black Jews. Some of the Ethiopian Jewry, right? And many of whom came to live in Israel. Yemenite Jewry can sometimes be very, very dark. There are Jews who have converted to Judaism. There are Jews who became part of the Jewish community in a variety of ways. You have interracial marriage, right? There is an entire organization. I'm gonna put that up as well. Oh, whoops, can't do that. Oh, here we go. Okay, and now I got to get my share screen. Here we are. Hopefully everybody can see this in just a moment. Okay, there's an organization, the Jews of Color Initiative. All right, meet our executive director, Alana Kaufman. So it's really important, that we keep this in mind, that we don't make all kinds of, statements that there are Jews of color out there. The website is, well, if you just Google Jews of Color Initiative. So what they try to do is very often, they are at the intersection of being Jewish and being Black or Hispanic or Asian. And it's very hard because sometimes they find people in either community right? That seem to be oblivious to them, and don't give them, you know, recognize them as somehow integral to the community. So, for instance, let me see if I can. There's an article, I'm going to talk about her in a moment, but Alice Walker, who is, Color Purple is a phenomenal book. Unfortunately, Alice Walker has also embraced some rather virulent anti-Semitism. We'll look at a poem that she wrote in a little bit. But in New York Magazine, there was an article by a woman named Nyla Burton. She is a Black Jewish woman. And she wrote, let's see. Okay. Let me find it. Okay. As a Black Jewish woman, I find the white Jewish community's focus on Black anti-Semitism hypocritical and distracting. Its negative impact is often exaggerated, and dwelling on it is counterproductive to racial justice and solidarity. But in an attempt to show compassion toward Black people, especially Black women, I sometimes find myself burying my own opinions about it at the expense of my soul. Recently, I was at an event, this is a Black event, where someone implied that Jews were naturally more conniving and exploitative. I shut down the conversation, but I wanted to flip the table in anger. What does that do to the soul of the Black Jewish woman, who is often rejected by both the white Jewish community and by the sisters who are supposed to understand her? So I would just, keep that in mind. The same, there's a wonderful book. Let me stop share for a moment. If you haven't read, this is a wonderful autobiography by Julius Lester. Julius Lester was interesting, played a role in the Black nationalist movement in the late 1960s, and on WBLI, which was a radio station that was really about Black liberation. I had a poem read by a student during the Ocean Hill-Brownsville teacher strike of 1968, which was the teachers union was largely Jewish, and the parents in Ocean Hill-Brownsville, the school district, were largely Black and Hispanic, and were looking for local school control, school board control. And they faced off, and it got awful. And there were some flyers that were anti-Semitic, and the teachers union flew off the I mean, it was a really, really difficult time. In any event, Julius Lester, it turned out that he did have some Jewish ancestry. His family came from Arkansas, and his great-grandfather was named Altshul. And eventually, his father was a Baptist preacher. He is a professor at University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He converts to Judaism. I had the good fortune of meeting him one Shabbat many years ago when Susan and I were on vacation in Northampton, and he served as a lay cantor for the conservative synagogue. And I, walked from our hotel downtown to the shul and got to meet him. I always thought he would be a great scholar in residence, but then he stopped doing scholar in residence gigs, and he just recently passed away. But he goes to a conference sponsored by the Cantors Assembly to learn about, how to learn how to be a lay davener. And he writes, "I did not know what to expect. As much as I love Judaism, it was still not easy for me to venture into the world of Jews. Many of them have mixed feelings about converts, and some are not shy about expressing those feelings. The comment I hear most often is, 'Didn't you have enough problems being Black?' The remark startles me because what the person is really saying is that he has a problem being Jewish. I generally respond by saying, 'Being Jewish is a joy for me.' And there was a woman who said sweetly, 'Oh, you're like Sammy Davis Jr.' I said, 'I wouldn't know. I've never met him.' Okay. I was not polite to the woman who said to me, 'Well, you're not really Jewish, you know.' I looked at her with my grandmama's eyes and said angrily, 'How dare you?' Many Jews and Gentiles feel that if you're not born Jewish, then you aren't really a Jew. I am learning, however, that the more religious the Jew, the less intense his problem. Only secularly identified Jews cannot accept that I, too, am a Jew." He also writes in his book about the difficulties he experiences in the Black community. He writes a piece in the Village Voice when, if you might recall this, Andrew Young was during Jimmy Carter's presidency, he was the ambassador to the UN. And he had some contacts with the PLO and had lied about it. And then they came to light and he was caught, flat-footed in a lie. And he resigned his post. And the Black press and some of the more, shall I say, some of the Black leadership really blamed the Jewish community as if they had, forced Andy Young to resign. Julius Lester thought there was a tremendous amount of hypocrisy and self-righteousness in their the way that they approached this matter. That they were only concerned, during the 70s, that they were concerned about Palestinian rights, which, are fine, but that when Jews were attacked in Ma'alot, right, a town in northern Israel, and there were school children that were attacked, there were terrorists that came by boat and to the coastline in the north, and where all of these terrorist events happened, or the murder of Israeli athletes at the Munich Olympics, that there was no condemnation by some of these same Black leaders. And so he took them to task and got a lot of flack from his colleagues in the, he taught in the Afro-American Studies program at the University of Massachusetts. So my point is that, when we talk about this issue, it's very important we remember that there are Jews of color, and whether in our community or anywhere else, and so we have to be sensitive and not make these wide pronouncements about groups of people. If you look at the history of Black people in America, and you look at Jewish people in America, you may wonder, if you really look at it carefully, why there would be any assumption of an alliance between these groups to begin with. First, most, and I'm using the term most, not all, but most Black Americans were Christian, right? So I'm going to share with you actually a very interesting from Richard Wright, great African American novelist, and he grew up in the South. So he talks about his first encounter with Jews, as does Horace Mann Bond. Horace Mann Bond was a distinguished Black educator. He's also the father of Julian Bond, who is from Georgia and who played an important role in the civil rights movement. In his autobiography, Black Boy, Richard Wright recalled his turn-of-the-century childhood in Arkansas. He remembered his first encounter with a Jewish storekeeper as a child of 5. All of us Black people who lived in the neighborhood hated Jews, not because they exploited us, but because we had been taught at home and in Sunday school that Jews were Christ killers. Along with his childhood friends, Wright would taunt the Jewish store owner and his children with the following: bloody Christ killers, never trust a Jew. Bloody Christ killers, what won't a Jew do? Distinguished Black educator Horace Mann Bond recounted a similar incident in his own early 20th century Georgia boyhood, okay? So we're going back 100 plus years now. One day he walked past a grocery store owned by Jews. A little boy standing out front began to shout the epithet nigger. Bond remembered instinctively replying, "You Christ killer?" Writing 50 years later, he was at a loss as to how the idea that the little boy was a Christ killer had entered into his mind. So obviously, Jews were capable of imbibing the prejudice of their neighbors, but then again, so were Blacks. Often the positions, the relationships between Blacks and Jews were ones of inequality. Landlord and tenant, right? Especially in the urban areas, and mostly more so in the North, where there were just larger concentrations of Black Americans in ghettos, especially after the Great Migration in the early decades of the century. 6 million or so Black Americans left the South to go north to places like Chicago, Detroit, Harlem. But landlord-tenant, sometimes employer-employee, merchant and shopper, and even as domestics. In the 1930s, it was called the Bronx slave market, and there was actually a sociological study done. You'd have these poor Black women who would stand on in certain corners that if you wanted to have a cheap cleaning lady, you could go to quote unquote the Bronx slave market, and many of those who came were Jewish women. And I know that many people had really warm, wonderful, loving relationships with African Americans. But you wonder, and I'm not going to ask anybody to volunteer, but some of the things that you read, were these folks welcome to sit down with the family at the dinner table or not? Would they feel quite as warm and as much a part of the family if they, when they were not with their employer family? And maybe the answer is yes, but in other cases, the answer perhaps was no. So positions of inequality, often don't really make for great alliances. And in the 1930s, there clearly were incidents of where blacks and Jews went head to head. There was a famous department store in Harlem called Bloomstein's that wouldn't hire. Now their clientele was 85% black, but they wouldn't hire any black salespeople, and they were boycotted. And there were, things got a little bit tense and even rough. So there were situations, less so in the South because it was a very different dynamic, but there were situations where this economic inequality, not because of any prejudices, but by the very nature of economic inequality, that these tensions produced some rather unpleasant interactions. A lot more recently, of course, there were many conversations in the Jewish community and the Black community about affirmative action. Jews historically had a very negative experience with quotas in Europe, but even here in the United States. In Europe, there was the numerus clausus, which kept very, very strict limits on Jewish access to professions or certain kinds of schools, and even in the United States, throughout the end of the 19th century, well into up until World War II, many of the upper crust and elite schools did not have, allowed only very, very limited numbers of Jewish students. My mother had her own experience trying to get a job as a secretary in the secretarial pool at a white shoe lawyer firm, and this is in Manhattan, where she applied to a job and she got it. But then she was told the day before she was supposed to start that there was a mistake, that there was no job. Her maiden name was Katz. And lo and behold, 2 days later, the ad was back in the newspaper. If you've seen the Academy Award-winning 1947 Best Picture film with Gregory Peck, Gentleman's Agreement, that's a pretty realistic view of that kind of social discrimination. It was not Jim Crow. These things often were unwritten, but they were very real. So Jews had very negative perceptions of affirmative action from their own historical bias, whereas African Americans often saw affirmative action as a way of creating a level playing field, that you can't go from centuries of enslavement and disenfranchisement, and that now the law abolishes all of the stumbling blocks, but pretend that you're now standing on equal footing. So very often there were cases where the organized Black community, the organized Jewish community, just did not agree on this issue. It really came much more to the fore in the 1970s with the Bakke decision, and it has periodically raised its head. It's not now as much as a wedge between the Black and Jewish communities, but certainly in the 1970s and 80s, it was. As far as Jewish racism and Black anti-Semitism. People are people, and just because you've had group experiences of discrimination doesn't necessarily purify or cleanse you of prejudice. I have heard, I don't know how often, the term Schwarze used by Jews. Now, Schwarze simply is Yiddish for black, but it's always in context. I mean, the N word is from the Latin meaning black as well, and nobody would suggest that it's a neutral word that doesn't carry any animus. Schwarze does as well. It's usually used in a pejorative way, and people can say that it's not, but just because one says that it isn't doesn't mean that is the case. And typically, when it's used, Schwarze is used in a to refer to something that's not nice or pleasant. You don't talk about a Pulitzer Prize winning author or a Nobel Peace Prize winner who's black as a Schwarze. Very often, I heard members of my extended family, particularly those who are older, refer to their housekeepers, their maids, as, oh, the Schwarze is coming next Tuesday. By the same token, even the greatest champions of civil rights, people like Jesse Jackson, were, caught with the microphone on, right? That famous or infamous Hymietown remark, which he did apologize for, but again, it sparked a lot of ill will and animus, because there were also people in the Black community who saw the act of apologizing as being a concession to weakness, right? So that only made things worse. And then, of course, that true anti-Semite, and I can say, this is not hyperbole, Louis Farrakhan, came into the mix with his own brand of spin and hatred, and just made matters worse. But many in the Black community didn't want to disown Farrakhan because it seemed like it was Step and Fetch It or Uncle Tom, or it was a sign that Blacks were not independent. They had to bow to Jewish opinion, or Jews as power brokers, et cetera, which was unfortunate, but there you go. So even those who should know better, who perhaps do know better, can sometimes themselves be purveyors of bigotry on both sides. One of the biggest touch points, of course, is Israel. There is actually a long history where Pan-Africanists, Black nationalists like Marcus Garvey, I mean, we're talking now the beginning of the 20th century, were great admirers of Jewish nationalism. Garvey thought Zionism was a model for Blacks, for persons of color throughout the Black world. People don't know who Edward Blyden is these days, but he was actually, at the turn of the 20th century, one of the primary exponents of Pan-Africanism, and believed very strongly in self-determination and for Africa being for Black people, and that they should be independent. So many of them looked at Zionism and thought it was just a marvelous model. Later, though, with the rise of anti-colonialism anti-imperialism, the independence movement that kicked the British, the French, the Belgians out of Africa and resulted in independence, was an inspiration for many young blacks who were still dealing with the legacy of racism and Jim Crow in this country. And I think it's not hard to understand what the attraction was of that kind of Black empowerment. Unfortunately, sometimes the historical pictures were not as full and as clear. Right? So one of the things that Arabs live in Africa, so they must be African as well. We know that Arabs were very much, Muslims were very much involved in the slave trade, not in Africa. And of course, Palestinians became a natural group of sympathy, right? Because it just fit into a pattern of, those who are oppressed by whites. The fact that Israel doesn't really fit into the pattern of colonialism in any form, shape, or manner, the way that countries in Africa that had been under Belgian, French, Portuguese, or British colonial authority did, was secondary. It didn't matter. It was the 6-Day War that really was a turning point. And you have folks like Stokely Carmichael, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which had started out as a very very robust protest organization, but one that absolutely shunned violence. In the late 60s, it dropped the N, right, the nonviolent, from its name. Stokely Carmichael took over. John Lewis, may he rest in peace, who was one of the co-founders, left SNCC precisely because it abandoned its message of nonviolence and began to embrace the rhetoric of Black power. The poetry of Leroy Jones, Amiri Baraka became his pen name, but he was Leroy Jones before he was Amiri Baraka. Not all those who were not all exponents of Black power were anti-Israel or anti-Jewish. One interesting exception, Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali actually went to Israel a number of times and spoke at Hebrew University. One of his very good friends was Billy Crystal, comedian Billy Crystal. In fact, Crystal spoke at Muhammad Ali's funeral and told this story. So, but be that as it may, there were certainly lots of folks in the Black Power camp, Black Panthers, Black nationalists, that had very ugly and anti-Semitic things to say about Israel. Now, let's not make any mistake. They were not criticizing specific elements of Israeli policy. They were demonizing and delegitimating the state of Israel as quote unquote a colonialist power. And that has been a third rail. Perhaps more so, right, as the possibility of a two-state solution seems to recede ever more, and the Netanyahu government, reflects a particular political bent, which brings me up to the Black Lives Matter movement. I want to just say a couple of very short things. Number one, and Eric Ross, who was on our guest for Tisha B'Av, pointed this out. Um, there are some folks who just, again, would prefer that there not be nuance and want on everything black and white. I'm not sure if a pun was intended or not, but there is no single Black Lives Matter. There is no headquarters in, Washington D.C. and this is their directive. It's a deliberately decentralized organization. Even their chapters have complete autonomy from one another. There are actually several different. There's the Movement for Black Lives. There's Black Lives Matter, and then of course there are people who just use the slogan Black Lives Matter to highlight the fact that very often, and even until this day, Black lives haven't mattered for many, or certainly not as much. So we have to be very careful when we speak as if there is some organized movement out there. There isn't. That isn't to say that some of the members and spokespeople who are within the umbrella of Black Lives Matter aren't peddling anti-Semitism. Some of the rhetoric that they have used to describe the state of Israel is classic extremist rhetoric that comes from the I'm not anti-Semitic, I'm only anti-Zionist, but Israel shouldn't exist, and Israel acts like a Nazi power. It certainly fits the classic, the classic definition that Sharansky gives of demonization, double standard, delegitimation. That rhetoric has been out there, and it's inexcusable, right? And I think it's fair to expect anyone who is responsible, whether in the Jewish community or in the Black community, to call it out. Calling out bigotry and racism and anti-Semitism and xenophobia and homophobia and all the other phobias is fair, and more than that, absolutely necessary to safeguard our society. That being said, I think we have to be very careful in tarring and feathering all those who have participated in peaceful marches, who have been a part of calling for an examination of the ways in which racism still function in our society. There still is institutional racism. If we look at the voices of a few members of a movement and refuse to look at the larger, broader picture and see that there is justice and legitimacy to the cause of institutional racism. If you don't believe me, go watch Just Mercy, the movie that is about the life of Brian Stevenson, and read about the Equal Justice Initiative, and look at the government's own statistics that you are 3 times more likely. Yes, there are more whites than blacks in this country, so more whites are killed by police. But just per capita, on the basis of population percentages, you are 3 times more likely to be killed if you are black and unarmed and mistaken, for whatever reason. We can talk about, is this conscious, is it subconscious? But the fact is, that's there. That convictions of Black Americans is much more likely. And these are real issues that we have to tackle. That doesn't excuse the people who are purveyors of anti-Semitism, who cloak themselves in Black Lives Matter. We have to call them out. But we also have to be careful not to throw the baby out with the bathwater. I remember something that David Ben-Gurion once said in a very different context, just as World War II was beginning. And the British had just issued a white paper, a government policy that closed the door to Jewish migration, to Jewish immigration into Palestine. So just when Jews needed it the most, one of the few places they could get to was closed shut firmly. And as World War II began, Ben-Gurion said, we must fight the Nazis as if the white paper does not exist. And we must fight the white paper as if the Nazis do not exist. So in other words, there are two things, and fighting against racism doesn't require that we be Pollyannish or naive about those in the Black Lives Matter movement that have engaged in some, very, very explosive rhetoric where Jews are concerned. By the same token, our fight for against racism in whatever form doesn't mean, or for a moment, that we have to excuse that. The one does not lessen the other. And before we open it up, and I would love to hear people's thoughts. The last thing I would say is where I think there is room for a commonality is, first of all, our values as Jews, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, justice, justice shall you pursue. That's a Jewish imperative. There's a reason why Jews were disproportionately involved in the civil rights movement. And I understand that it was very different in the North than in the South. But part of that was kind of a secularization of Jewish religious impulses, protecting the poor, the needy, the disenfranchised. These were things that are part of the Torah and are part of Isaiah and a part of our ancient heritage at a time when these things didn't really exist in other ancient societies. So pursuing social justice is a legitimate avenue for the expression of Torah. It's not the only kind of Torah, but it is an important form of Torah. It's an absolute part of what our religious tradition has bequeathed us. And finally, we too have known adversity, not in the same way. I had a friend in college who, came to our Seder. He happened to be Black. And he said, I really appreciate this. This is very moving and meaningful, but we're sitting around your dining room table and, there's the fine china and everybody is, eating 6 different courses and everybody wants to know, when's the brisket coming, which is the 5th question. And everybody's very comfortable. And people are looking at their watches when the Seder will be over. This is not a gathering of people who have come out of Egypt, who know what slavery is like, who can see accounts of their grandfather or great-grandfather talking about experiences of being enslaved. If you look at some of the old film footage from the 1930s, there are interviews with former slaves talking about what slavery was like. And these were people, of course, at the time, who then were in their 70s and 80s. So, we have to understand that in this country, we have largely succeeded. That isn't to say we haven't encountered anti-Semitism. But our experience on these shores has been that of other white immigrant groups, by and large. Upward mobility, acceptance. African Americans have had a very different set of experiences. And yet, for us as Jews, historical memory is long. We just had Tisha B'Av and we fasted and sat on the floor and, lamented the destruction of the temple 2,700 years ago. So we have just only 75 years ago the experience of the Shoah. That's very different. The Holocaust is a unique experience that you cannot compare to anything else, including the experience of American slavery. But rather than make invidious comparisons, there's nothing worse saying, you know, let's measure how much I've suffered versus how much you've suffered. That's not helpful. But rather, as we look at the adversity that we've experienced, we should have, wherever we find people who have suffered, we should have more of an empathy. It's our tradition that says, Ki gerim haytem be'eretz Mitzrayim, that you should love the stranger in your midst. It's right there in Leviticus, because you too were strangers in the land of Egypt. So I'm going to stop there and, you know, and just close by saying again, there are a lot of differences between the Black and Jewish communities. Invariably, their historical experiences are going to result in very different views. But nevertheless, there is a need for us as minorities in different ways and as Americans to join together in fighting against bigotry and prejudice, because one form of bigotry very easily morphs into another, and that is in our best interest, and it is also genuine and very much reflective of what our tradition teaches. So I know we have a bunch of people. I don't know if you want to be helpful to either you just, I guess you could raise your hand, and I would like to call on whoever. I see Bruce is raising his hand. So in deference to the past Southeast USY president, go ahead, Bruce. You can unmute yourself. Can you unmute yourself? I think here. Nope, you're still muted.
Am I muted now?
You're good.
Yeah. In my recent conversation with Danny Siegel, when he and I were discussing that speech at the USY National Convention, when I told him this, he said it really rang true. You could take that speech, which was given 57 years ago, and change the word Negro to Black, and we shall overcome to Black Lives Matter. And unfortunately, many of the principles would still ring true.
We've made a lot of progress, but you know, there's always more to go.
Yes.
There's no question. So, I'd love to hear, you know, other folks' perspectives, other comments. Just you can wave. Okay. I see Stephen Cantor. Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah, I want to make.
Whoops. Yeah, go ahead. You're still muted though.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Absolutely.
Okay, I was born and brought up in the Boston area, and at that time, it was a predominantly Jewish area, Roxbury, Dorchester, and Mattapan, over 90,000 Jewish people. Then when there was Black migration into the area, they moved into the Jewish areas. And many of the shop owners were Jewish. And many of the shop owners were very kind to the Blacks. They gave them credit, they didn't even charge them. We had a friend who owned a hardware store. And when Martin Luther King, unfortunately, was assassinated, that Black community ran rampage. They destroyed Jewish stores. And that particular hardware store was burnt. And the owner cried. He said, why? I was very kind to all these people. What were they left alone was
Right.
American Jewish kosher products, because the Blacks at that time wanted those products because of the halal. That was one comment. Another comment regarding affirmative action, which probably is very important. But I heard a comment that many people wouldn't go to a Black doctor, not because they were prejudiced. They would never know that this person get through medical school because he was accepted as part of the affirmative action and may not have been qualified as much as another non-affirmative action candidate.
Right. Although, I mean, again, you know, in looking at those, if we were to look at that attitude critically, if somebody is, you know, is board certified and, you know, passes licensing exams, which are the same for individuals of all color, and affirmative action was about acceptance for admission. It wasn't that you had to have an 85 average to graduate if you were white, but a 70 average if you were black. So I think we have to, and I'm not saying that, you know, there are pros and cons that people have to affirmative action, but that could lend itself to a rather, you know, prejudiced view. So we'd have to be, you know, so I would caution, you know, being careful with that. How about people who have not, you know, I know Wendy always has something that she'd like to say, and I'd
Yeah,
love to
but
hear.
this is in relation to what he just said.
Yes,
We
Wendy.
had it was reversed. We had very close friends in Memphis who he had been stationed in Puerto Rico and his oldest child was born there, and they were Jewish. And when David wanted to go to medical school, he called Joe and they were discussing, you know, what he could do. And Joseph said to him, you were Puerto Rican and you're Jewish. You're a double minority. And he applied to a black school and got in.
Okay, there you
So
go.
I just he went to Mahari Medical School. Anyway, I thought that was funny.
Someone who hasn't, you know, had a chance to share a perspective or an opinion. Go ahead, Jill.
Hi, thank you for a fabulous lecture tonight. So I wanted to ask you the document that you shared, the Rules of Civil Discourse.
Yes.
I would really like a copy of that because so many times I want to have a discussion with somebody or somebody wants to engage me. And, you know, I want cooler heads to prevail. And I'd also like to speak to people who don't have the same point of view as I do. And I've never really known how to approach it. That's the first part of
I'd be
my,
happy to. You might also, I would encourage you to look online at the Kettering Institute,
I don't know
Charles
what
F.
it is.
Kettering Institute, and their National Issues Forum is what they do. And by the way, that we have some of this done locally, where people are brought together to talk about these really, you know, third rail issues in a way that pros and cons can be shared and focused on ideas. But if you'll see that a lot of this is, you can either look up the National Issues Forum or the Kettering Foundation. They're out of Dayton, Ohio, and they do marvelous civil discourse and, you know, democracy through dialogue.
I like it. That's great. And I just wanted to say that I've been involved in a Jewish Muslim women's study group, and we set a lot of ground rules. And with that done, we had the most amazing discussions, learning so much about each other, and as most often you find out more in common than not. So
Right. Which, by the way, in some instances, and I'm not saying this is just for Jews and Muslims, it's for Democrats and Republicans. Some folks don't want to do that precisely because they're afraid that they will discover their commonalities and it'll be much harder to maintain, you know, the rigid beliefs that if they actually listen to what somebody has to say, And if you sit down with somebody who's a Trump supporter, for example, and listen to their concerns that somehow you might be tainted because now you have a more nuanced view. And you know, and the opposite, you know, for coming from the right, that if you sit down with somebody, if you're Jewish and you sit down with Muslims and discuss things, you're going to come out, you know, and somehow tainted, and you won't be committed to Israel, and you will be, you know, and that's just not true. You actually will sometimes have to just respectfully agree to disagree, but you've stopped demonizing one another.
Right.
And that's true in the Black Jewish community as well.
Thank you. The whole series is fantastic.
Thanks, Joe. I'm glad you've joined. Sophie, yes, go ahead. You have to unmute though. Unless there's some lip readers.
Okay, I have a question about the increase of anti-Semitism in the last 2 years. What is your opinion? Especially,
I don't know if you listen to, so anti-Semitism, yes, it has definitely increased, and we have seen it increase on both the left and the right, in different ways. It manifests itself in very different ways, but it has definitely increased, and measurably so. We had a program the other night, last week, with Eric Ross, our regional, I guess his title is Senior Associate Director for the ADL here in Florida, and he had, you know, a lot of slides. And yes, it is a real issue, but it does come from both ends of the spectrum in different ways. We can't forget that the shooting in Chabad in California, and of course, that Tree of Life in Pittsburgh were for people who, you know, were representing a kind of white supremacist neo-Nazi view. They were working as lone wolves, as individuals. But you also have expressions of anti-Semitism in, you know, from the left, it can often be more insidious because it's cloaked as quote unquote anti-Zionism. But the language and the kind of demonization and delegitimation which it uses clearly points to the anti-Semitism. So it's, they're both issues. You know, would I rather be poisoned or shot? I would prefer neither. So, but absolutely, there has been an increase in anti-Semitism, and we would do well not to be less vigilant, but to be more. Lois, Stephanie.
Yes. Well, I'm not sure that I understand why more isn't being done in Jacksonville. My previous organization, where some know that where I work, JCCI, was a citizens think tank, and it brought people together for 40 years to talk about issues. There was never once on 75 studies or so that I knew of that the political aspect of things got hot. People came in with level heads, wanting to do the best for Jacksonville. And that's been gone now about 5 years, which is really unfortunate. And the Times-Union still in the last week has referred to JCCI studies several times. But I know that you're a part of One Jacks, and there are discussions there. I know there are the tables that go down Bay Street for conversations. But I really don't understand why we don't have more vehicles. I know there's pulpit sharing sometimes, but I'm talking about real conversations among people in Jacksonville. And if we want to say the Black community, the Jewish community, I haven't seen many opportunities for that to happen. And I wonder why not.
This is a very good question. I don't know that I have a very good answer. One Jacks stays away from quote unquote politics by and large.
Yeah, I know.
They will highlight controversial themes, but for the sake of engaging in civil discourse, whether it's Confederate statues or gun control, to bring different views together, to model how you have a menschlich debate and discussion. But they don't take political positions on those issues.
Yeah.
They did support the HRO, the Human Rights Ordinance, because it was within the purview. If it has to do with rights, if it has to do with fighting against intolerance or prejudice or any, phobia of one kind, whether it's homophobia, anti-Semitism, racism, Islamophobia, whatever it may be, they do take a stand on those issues. I can tell you that we have tried to reach out to those often on the other side. And again, it's hard. People like to stay in their own ideological zip codes. And it's been, when we had this program co-sponsored with the Chamber of Commerce to have these, dinner conversations, people would get together and talk. The hope was we were going to get a very diverse group of people together, Southern Baptists and people who are advocates for gay rights and across the board, people who were in favor of women's pro-choice, anti-abortion, and we were going to sit down and have conversations. Didn't happen.
Well,
Everybody said it was like sitting around and having everybody. It was a sort of an echo chamber. We all agreed. We had a lovely dinner. I've hosted a number of these, but
that's not where it's at. But
fortunately, and that's a problem. That's a real problem.
it's a problem, but we've been saying it for 50 years. And I'll have to say this out loud. I'm disappointed that our federation has never dealt with this. I think it's the central address, if you will, for the Jewish community. And in other communities, we don't even have CRC.
Yeah, Community Relations Council. Jewish Community Relations
I don't
Council.
think we have that anymore. We had it for years at the Federation. I haven't seen it for years. And to me, it should be one of the main things that it does is to improve community relations. And if we want to say that that's the Black community at this point, fine. I would go with that. I don't understand why this initiative hasn't happened through our rabbis and through our federation, through our community agencies. And I think we've sat on our hands to try. We can talk about it, we can have these classes, but unless we really work on it, nothing's ever going to happen.
That's I can't speak about federation because that would be a no-no.
Well, I know it might be for you, but it's
let
not for me.
federation respond to. I'll have to allow federation's leadership to respond for itself.
But is there a problem with the rabbis going to the federation and saying, don't you meet occasionally and either as a group or are used to, forget about pandemic, but
not all the rabbis are necessarily on the same page with that either. So, but I'll leave it there.
that's a shame.
Larry, Dr. Goldberg.
Regarding the business about Jews of color, I listened to a seminar last week that was done by the seminary, and there was a Black rabbi who found that when people ask her story, how do you come to be Jewish? She found that to be objectionable, found it to be racist, and her answer to them is, why do you want to know? And when people sort of say, well, I'm just curious, she found whether she was being extraordinarily defensive. I mean, most of us are very acquainted with the white Ashkenazic background. And I'm curious of how, and I think it's important for all of us to understand how Jews get to where they are. It's the same thing that I would ask Sephardic about that. I'm not so sure. I mean, she really found it to be racist, and maybe you can explain it to me, or maybe I'm not sure how we get to where we are. It's not to denigrate where she is. If I asked that question, it wouldn't be that I didn't think she should be there or that she shouldn't be Jewish. I'm just curious how people get to where they are, even though I accept them as they are currently.
Right. And, you know, I think that sometimes there may be very well-intentioned, I say insensitivities, they're certainly not conscious or deliberate. Look, and I've encountered this from Gentiles. Very small example. About, I don't know, it was 2-3 years ago, it was over winter vacation, and on Airbnb, we rented a house on St. George Island, which is, you know, it's off the forgotten coast of Florida, and it really is a forgotten coast. It's halfway over west in the Panhandle. There's this island, and there's, you know, the closest Starbucks is 60 miles away in Panama City. All right, closest movie theater is not a place where there are Jews. The closest synagogue is either, you know, Panama City or Tallahassee. And we went fishing. We chartered a fishing boat for half a day. Captain Krista, lovely woman, grew up on St. George Island. For her, going into Apalachicola was going to the big city. And so I introduced, you know, ourselves, and I said, this is my son Elior and Itamar, and she said, well, what kind of names are those? I said, they're biblical names, and they're Hebrew. And you know, she asked where we lived. I said Jacksonville. And anyway, at the end of the charter, she was taking a video, and this was New Year's Eve, and she said, how about if y'all say Happy New Year in your language? For her, I was a foreigner. The fact that I, you know, was obviously American English was my native language. I had kids with weird, you know, Hebrew Jew names, and God knows if she'd ever met a Jew. So very innocently, she said, you know, say Happy New Year in your language. And I said, Happy New Year. I said, okay, all right, Shana Tova. So sometimes people who are well-intentioned just may not know. I can imagine why somebody who's a rabbi but a person of color, people don't ask me, you know, how did you get to be Jewish? Or they just, you know, I'm the bald, bearded guy with, I kind of look like a rabbi. I look Jewish, whatever. So on the other hand, people tell their stories and know that they have singular stories to tell. Angela Buchdahl, who's the rabbi at the Central Synagogue, who's Korean, Korean Jewish. Her father was Jewish, her mother Korean. And, you know, if you really want to read a very poignant story, Alice Walker, who has gone off the deep end, there's a poem on her website. Gosh, let me think I can pull it up. It's pretty horrific. Let's see if I can. Here it is. Let me just. So this is on her, this is on her website. Sorry. Do this, and I need to share. Here we are. Okay. Let's see. It is our duty, I believe, to study the Talmud. It is within this book that I believe we will find answers to some of the questions that most perplex us. Let's see. Study hard with an open, if deeply offended mind until you can sift the false and the true. Is Jesus boiling eternally in hot excrement for his crime of throwing the bankers out of the temple? For loving, standing with, and defending the poor? Was his mother Mary a whore? Are goyim, us, meant to be slaves of Jews? Not only that, but to enjoy it? Are 3-year-old and a day girls eligible for marriage and intercourse? Are young boys fair game for rape? Must even the best of the goyim, us again, be killed? And so, it's, if you read the whole poem, but it's horrible. But Alice Walker, the official website, and there it is our frightful duty right there. That's what she wanted to put on her in the front of her website. Now she was married briefly in the 1970s to a lawyer named Mel Leventhal, but Jewish, and they had a daughter. And the daughter, I'm sorry, and the daughter. So the daughter is, her father is Jewish, her mother, and white, and her mother is Alice Walker. She wrote her autobiography is called Black, White, and Jewish. And she's had a horrible time with Alice Walker as her. But I mean, she's encountered a kind of alienation sometimes from both sides. So I think it might be oversensitive when the question is just, being asked out of simple curiosity. But I suppose if you hear it all the time, you probably feel like you're a little bit of a curiosity or an oddity.
Yeah, I guess maybe it's akin to, my birthday is April 1st, and every time I say my birthday is April 1st, I get, April Fool. And it may be the same thing. You don't look Jewish, what's your story, And
Well, that's the other thing. Funny you don't look Jewish is not a great opening line.
Well, no. But I just kind of thought it's sort of important for us to understand how people come to where they are without it being offensive. But maybe it is. Maybe my curiosity. I need to just damp it down. And if people want to talk about their stories, then, or they want to write about them, then I should read about them, but not ask about them.
One of the wonderful ways of I've used it on a number of occasions, like as an entree into a conversation about being Jewish and what it really means, is Lenny Bruce, Jewish versus Goyish. It makes you think. It's Lenny Bruce, so it's not, but it makes you think about attitudes of what exactly, lime soda, Goyish, lime jello, very Goyish, Ray Charles, Jewish, so it makes you think about what exactly, makes something Jewish other than people identifying with it. But anyway, maybe one or two more comments and then we'll call it a night, because it's starting to get late. Is there anybody else who wants to just make a comment on what we were talking about tonight, or any other parts of the past segments. Alan, go ahead.
I guess in response to that, having converted to Judaism, if people know I've converted to Judaism and they ask me about it, I'm very proud and happy to tell my story that involves an Orthodox rabbi and G. Gordon Liddy and a wonderful path that's gotten me to where I am here today. But I've never had anybody who didn't know I was a convert to Judaism come up and ask me, what's your path to Judaism? So I could see how if my skin color were different and I looked differently, somebody asked me that, I could understand the perception of that. Whereas maybe a better question is, what brought you on a path to become a rabbi? Something you knew about the person. And I don't know if you've been ever asked that rabbi, but I think that might be, that might be a better path. Just one other thing about races. I was raised Catholic in Wisconsin. There were 550 people in my graduating class. There were 3 Black people, right? My father grew up on a farm. He had 15 people in his high school class. He never met a Black person until he went into the Army. And he tells stories about the treatment he saw in the early 1960s of the black men he served with, about how the racism against him. And I think it changed him some. He still has some racist tendencies in him that I struggle with dealing with him. But a beautiful story I treasure about my father, when I told him that I was converting to Judaism and I was going to get married by a rabbi. I was actually struggling with telling my parents about this and how to go about this. So my mother's response is, well, why can't she come play for our team? But my father's response, which I will eternally cherish, was, it's important for you to become Jewish because there are more similarities between us than there are differences. And the important thing is for you to have unity in your family. And it struck me so deeply that day, and it still does today. So I just wanted to share that.
That's a beautiful sentiment.
Thank you.
I think there was, Michelle, did you want to, and then I see Alana and Dave. Okay, then we'll make those our last 2. And I'm happy to carry the conversation on, at some other point. But I also want to be mindful of the time. Go ahead, Michelle, and then Alana and Dave.
Well, I have 2 comments. One is that I think the Jewish experience of being traumatized by our environment has been so long, so frequent, 2,000 years, then we were thrown out of England in the 1200s and flown out of another place in the 1300s and Spain in the 1400s and on and on and on. And every place that we got thrown out of, wherever we went, I think we tried to make a life. And we have done that with mixed fortunes. I think that probably the United States has been most kind of all the places other than our Jewish homeland. But, and perhaps, the Black slavery memories are just, even though they're just a few hundred years, it's probably too close, ours have been thousands of years and numerous. But I think also that what concerns me is, and I don't know enough other than to express a concern, is that it just always seemed that the Jewish culture invested itself in itself over and over again. If we couldn't go to a school, then we had a hater, we're always really invested. I mean, big Jewish organizations that deeply invested in ourselves. And we did it with mixed reviews, and some better, some worse. And I just don't know how the now prominent and successful Black world is investing personally in the Black circumstance. You know, where are there Black bankers that are supporting, you know, investment in Black industry and in Black, you know, enterprise, you know? And I think that that's part of the fabric and the landscape of what needs to be done to heal what has gone on. And I don't know enough about that environment, but it just seems like their resources need to be garnished in a public way. You know, why can't, for example, Whoopi Goldberg say, I'm going to take over X school and this one take off Y school? You know what I'm saying? You know the principle I'm getting at. And I think that would help to build up kind of a self-image of success that gets passed from generation to generation, in addition to what, you know, institutionally the government ought to do and other institutions ought to do to make things better, you know? So maybe somebody could speak to the, you know, Black enterprise that can be helpful.
So I don't know that I would much prefer somebody in the Black community to respond. I will say that there are the number of successful Black bankers, entrepreneurs, etc. It is not so large versus the number of Black Americans. We are only 6 million Jews in this country, whereas the number of Black folk in this country is roughly at about 20%. So if you can do the math, that's like 65 million people. The Black middle class is a lot smaller than the Jewish middle class. You look at figures of poverty, the issues of poverty and all that goes along with poverty. That is a legacy of our society over hundreds of years, and there simply wouldn't be enough of a Black upper class, let alone a Black middle class. Obviously, there's a larger Black middle class now than there was 50 years ago, and it's grown, but still not proportionately to the issues that we face. But more than those very broad stroke observations, I think you'd need to have somebody who is an expert in that area address it, because I'm just a rabbi. Go ahead, Alana and Dave.
Hi. Well, two comments. One, just kind of spur of the moment is kind of in response to what Michelle just said. And I'm a lawyer, so a lot of my African American Black friends and former colleagues who were also lawyers, like without exception, every single one of them does try to support the Black community in different ways, by supporting, charter schools, by supporting, mentorship programs. So from what I've seen with my very limited anecdotal experience, it's pretty much 100% of the Black people that I know who have achieved success, all of whom I believe had, certainly one of my closest friends came from a very rough childhood, but they all turn around and help. So that's what I've experienced in my life. And then the other point was kind of, I thought the question about asking converts of color about what led them to Judaism was interesting. And it was also interesting to hear Alan's experience, because I was curious if you, Rabbi, had experienced. I've heard from friends of mine that are converts that they actually, that are white, that they don't like being asked about what led them to Judaism, or actually, like, one of them changed her name. Her name is Talia. I don't know the name that she was given at birth, and I guess I shouldn't have asked. I was like, she mentioned that she changed it. She wouldn't share her original name, and I was told by them that, like, they don't like feeling othered within the Jewish community. They want to feel included, and that every time, even though they're white, every time somebody asks them, you know, why are you here? It's kind of like, or how did you get here? It feels maybe a little bit like, you're not one of us. What are you doing here? So.
Right. Well, look, I will tell you that the Talmud, the Mishnah, very clearly says in the tractate Baba Metzia that we have to treat converts to Judaism exactly equal, and not to remind them of their status as converts, because somebody who becomes, what do you call a Jew by choice? A Jew. So that goes right back to the Talmud. That's not a racial thing. That's not a that's so in general there is a tremendous amount of sensitivity that our textual tradition shows, understanding that we are a little shtetl, we are rather tribal in some ways, and if you become a member of the tribe, you may at times feel that you don't belong because you don't have that same history. There was a convert in the medieval period who wrote to Maimonides saying, how can I say this stuff about, the land that God gave our ancestors? They weren't my ancestors. Maimonides responded, they are your ancestors. You've adopted them. Right? You can adopt ancestors as much, at least Jewishly you can, as much as you can adopt, children or grandchildren. There is reverse, there is reverse adoption in the Jewish world. So that's true in general. And sometimes Jews by choice, with even, forget about the color issue, can sometimes feel not fully, there are people who don't accept converts in a cultural sense, religiously. And I think Julius Lester was 100% correct, that the more observant you are and the more you understand Judaism and practice Judaism seriously, the more you understand that you have a religious obligation to treat Jews by choice as fully enfranchised members of the community. Those who subscribe to more of this cultural, ethnic, Yiddish humor, Borscht Belt, are the ones that are often less accepting, because they, either you're sort of like in the same way, or what makes you Italian? You can't convert into Italianness or Irishness. You're born Irish or you're born Italian.
Rabbi,
That's not actually what Judaism has to say about being Jewish, but for some folks who treat Jewishness like just another white European ethnicity, which it isn't, that's the sensibility they bring to it. Lois, all right, I'll let you have the last word.
I just wanted to ditto what Ilana said. In all of my years with working with many, many Black professionals in Jacksonville, every single one of them is intensely involved with various arts organizations or organizations that are promoting understanding and trying to build the Black community. I don't know a single one that wasn't involved. And also, did you happen to see the letters from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar recently, echoed after he wrote it by Charles Barkley, that said, hey man, what are you guys talking about? Not, talking about Jews not being friends of Blacks. So there is an understanding out there. We just need more of it.
Well, right. It all depends where you want to look. So anyway, on that note, thanks to everybody for joining. We'll pick up with a new series that I'm working on now. It's a time machine series where we'll get to visit. If you've ever seen the historical those like 1491, they give a year, and it's sort of like what life would have been like for you in 1491. So it's the Rosh Hashanah time machine. So we'll go to different places in different years and kind of get a flavor of what life would have been like for us if we had lived in, I don't know, Spain in 1391 on Rosh Hashanah, or whatever years we pick. So that's in the works. But in the meantime, thanks all for being a part. I am hopeful of putting out a bibliography, because some people have asked me about this, and I don't know where we'll post it, but that should be ready in the next couple of days. So if you're interested in doing more reading on your own, I would, be happy to give you some ideas for books. Well, Lila Tov to everybody, and
Laila Tov.
as who was it? Gosh, good night and good luck. Who said that? Edward R. Murrow. So, good night and good luck.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
You're welcome. Bye bye.